seen this before. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose ancestral land we are gathered, at least virtually, today, and to pay respects and acknowledge leaders, both past, present, and emerging. Welcome to our second live streamed New South Wales Science and Research Breakfast Seminar, necessitated by the ongoing social distancing restrictions imposed by the current COVID-19. Depending on these being eased, we're hopeful, in fact, that our next seminar on the 19th of August may be able to be held at Parliament House. However, we will continue to live stream the seminar series going forward. And for anyone who must leave early, an edited version of today's talk will be available on our website later today, alongside videos of our previous seminars. Unlike last time, let me remember to say about how you ask questions in this. What happens is the audience can submit questions during the seminar via the button on their screen. These will be read out at the end to Liz. We're going to very briefly now play a short instructional video on how to do this. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Liz Pellicano, Developmental Cognitive Scientist and Research Fellow at the Department of Educational Studies at Macquarie University. Liz works in the fascinating field of autism science, an area which has seen a great increase in international investment over the last 2 decades. Yet despite this support, remarkably little of this research maps the everyday experience of autism as understood by autistic people to themselves. It is also largely not translated into meaningful interventions that can help autistic people overcome the obstacles they frequently face in life. Liz has been investigating why this might be the case and what autism scientists need to do about it through a series of major studies funded by the UK's Medical Research Council, the European Commission, and the Australian Research Council. Her findings challenge the conventional wisdom of autism science and encourage us to think again about the way we approach the relationship between laboratory and life. Liz initially trained as a developmental and educational psychologist at the University of Western Australia, completing her PhD on the cognitive profile of autistic children. She was a junior research fellow in psychiatry at the University of Oxford, and in 2009, joined the newly created Centre for Research in Autism and Education at the University College London Institute for Education. Liz became the Centre's director in 2013 and a professor of autism education in 2015, before returning to Australia in 2017 to take up a current position at Macquarie. In 2019, she was awarded a future fellowship from the Australian Research Council. She's the research leader within the Autism Cooperative Research Centre, the world's first national cooperative research effort focused on autism across the lifespan. Her work has been recognised through several international awards, including a Philip Levelheim Prize. Please join me in welcoming Professor Liz Pellicano as she presents Knowing Autism.
Thank you so much, Hugh, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Just going to share my slides. So I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and learn today, wherever we are. For me, it's also the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay deep respects to elders past, present and future. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. I also recognise that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. I feel very honoured to be part of this breakfast seminar series. There's been a whole host of eminent speakers, and I feel very privileged to be among them. And I feel even more privileged to be able to talk about a topic that is close to my own heart and affects so many Australians so deeply. Autism is likely to affect you in some way too. If you're not autistic yourself, you are very likely to know of someone who is autistic, whether that be your son or daughter, your neighbour, your cousin, your friend or colleague. So it's vitally important that we all know autism. The problem is that we don't. And I'm going to argue today that autism science, as it has been conventionally conducted, is part of the problem. So before that, let me go back to where this started for me. When I was a student studying a psychology, a Bachelor of Science at the University of Western Australia, it was then as a 19-year-old that I found myself working one afternoon every week with a beautiful little 4-year-old boy who had a diagnosis of autism and his family. And each of those afternoons, we'd sit together at the wooden kitchen table in their house in Canning Vale, which is a suburb on the edge of Perth. And slowly, bit by bit, I'd try to help him with his language skills, or I'd throw a ball to him to help him with his coordination. And those interactions changed my life. I was totally inspired by him, his mum, his dad, and his sister. They had some really trying times, but they taught me a lot about support, about resilience, about empathy, and also about the everyday realities of autism. Working with this family really spurred my interest and desire to become a scientist so that I could grasp what autism is and work out how people who are autistic or live with someone who is autistic can lead the best lives possible. Now, studying back in the late 1990s, early 2000s was exciting, intoxicating even. There seemed to be an explosion of theoretical insights and empirical work, and autism research really seemed to be blossoming as a discipline. Now, this could, of course, be my youthful enthusiasm, but it turns out that it wasn't just me experiencing this. So billions of dollars worldwide were indeed being spent at that point in time in autism research. It was a massive investment that culminated in 2006 when President George W. Bush signed the Combating Autism Act, which appropriated $950 million to autism research over 5 years and provided grant programs for states to develop autism screening, early diagnosis, and intervention programs for children. In the UK, the funding portfolio of the Medical Research Council also increased for autism with a boost in government funding. And here in Australia, the Autism CRC was established 7 years ago and funded to the tune of more than 30 million Australian dollars, making it the world's first national cooperative research effort focused on autism. So there's been a lot of money targeted towards autism research. And these data here come from the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee in the US. And they show that in 2016 alone, there were 1,552 autism-related projects, totaling almost $400 million in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States, with the US contributing the bulk of that funding. And closer to home, my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Jack Den Houting, and I conducted the very first portfolio analysis for Australian autism research, which is a comprehensive review of autism-specific research grants over the past 10 years, which we divided into 2 5-year periods, so that you can see on the slide. On the top part of the slide, between 2008 and 2012, there was just under 14 million total investment in grants. And then in 2013 to 17, it was just under 44 million total investments in grants. So over that 10-year period, we've seen an increase of 30 million or 215%. And there's been an enormous explosion, exponential surge in publications in autism as a result that far surpasses the growth in other fervent areas like ADHD. So there's a lot of money going into autism research and consequently a lot of outputs, a lot of papers on autism. But despite this hugely encouraging trend, the fruits of this research are still not being felt anything like directly enough by the broader autistic and autism communities. In short, we've done all this work, we've published all these papers, but where has it got us? It hasn't changed lives. In fact, the life chances of millions of autistic people remain extraordinarily bleak. Autistic people experience substantial economic inequalities. Despite all of their talents and all of their dedication, only a minority of autistic people enjoy full-time paid employment. More are in some sort of paid part-time work, but that is lower than people from other disability groups, including intellectual disability. And the minority of autistic adults who are employed are all too often in posts that are deemed unsuitable. Either they're not consistent with their skill sets and abilities, or they're overqualified. Now, these inequalities also extend further. Research tells us that autistic adults are far less likely than non-autistic people to live independently or to have friends and more intimate relationships. Many also have co-occurring difficulties with their physical and mental health, which can be debilitating and require often substantial ongoing support. And most disturbingly, recent evidence suggests that autistic people suffer from premature death. Autistic people die, on average, 16 years earlier than non-autistic people, and 9 times more likely to die of suicide. None of us should be satisfied with facts like these. And it's not at all surprising that autism science is beginning to be called out as a result. Of course, scientific failures alone are not to blame, but increasingly, autistic people themselves are suggesting that the massive public investment in autism science demands a greater return. At the moment, they're simply not seeing any of the sorts of benefits that one would hope to see. Now, this, of course, is just part of a broader phenomenon. In 2018, an editorial in Nature insisted that too much research done in the name of society fails to be of direct use to society. As the Nature editorial continued, this is in part because other people, so policymakers, politicians, business leaders, don't take enough notice of the findings of science. But it's also a result of fundamental problems with some of the science itself. And in the rest of this talk, I will suggest that the ways in which autism science is conventionally conducted, and especially the methods it deploys, contributes to these less than desired outcomes and the declining public faith in autism science. I'll also suggest some ways to fix it. I am, of course, not alone in this view at all. And as the Nature editorial suggests, the problems go far broader than autism alone. Across the health and medical sciences in recent years, leading scholars have been grappling with this question of why massive investment in science has failed to have the kinds of returns that broader society has a right to expect. This article from The Lancet surveyed a number of possibilities, and these included, first, the so-called reproducibility crisis, which suggests that even highly cited experiments might not even be replicable. Second, the limited accessibility of the research. The question, that is, of whether research findings are easily available to key decision makers and other stakeholders outside the scientific community, as suggested by advocates of the open science movement. And third, whether the design and methods deployed by scientists, often for good experimental reasons, have actually also generated problems of their own. And it's that last one, the one about research, design, and methods, that's where my thinking focuses on. So let me put it bluntly. My suggestion is that autism science isn't enabling us to make the breakthroughs we need as a society because the methods we are currently deploying do not enable scientific endeavour to map on to people's everyday experiences. In other words, there's too big a gap between lab and life. And consequently, we don't know what we need to know about autism. So let me explain. Basic autism science, particularly in the fields of psychology and cognitive neuroscience, has focused predominantly on studying autism within the lab. So carefully controlled, simplified settings where you can manipulate variables and discover causal relationships between one factor and another. The established experimental method is autism scientists' bread and butter. And there are very good reasons for this approach, which has been enormously fruitful to the study of human cognition. But there is an obvious problem too. This almost exclusive reliance on lab-based work has resulted in paradigms that are simple, contrived, and artificial, and thus limit the applicability of findings to the more complex situations that people experience in everyday life. That is, there's been a failure of lab-based work to map on to real-life settings. The findings lack what we call external validity. They fail a test of generalizability. Now, this is a problem by itself, but it is an even bigger problem in autism science as a result of some fundamental features of autism itself. Autistic people struggle in some situations more so than in others. Their performance on tasks, that is, shifts depending on the context in which those tasks take place, far more than non-autistic people. So in previous work, my colleague, Professor David Burr, and I have explained how autistic people perceive the world in a fundamentally different way because they rely more on incoming sensory input and less on prior knowledge or knowledge accrued with experience. As such, one of the key differences between autistic and non-autistic people lies in the way that they process information in situations when levels of uncertainty are high. Autistic people rely much less on their prior knowledge in these situations in particular. So we should be less likely to uncover the ways in which autistic people experience the world in lab-based and often very controlled circumstances. Rather, differences should occur predominantly when uncertainty mounts, particularly in less controlled real-world settings. Autism research is therefore disproportionately disadvantaged by its over-reliance on controlled laboratory research, all of which could lead to fundamental misunderstandings of autism itself. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of this mismatch between lab and life from my own work to show you why we really need to change the ways that we do autism science to fully know autism. Now, my first example relates to visual search. Now, there have been a whole host of studies over the years that have argued that autistic people show a strong propensity for being able to find things hidden in larger arrays. Now, these images on the slide come from classic visual search paradigms in which the participant must locate a target amongst an array of distractors, like in these examples of feature search on the top or conjunction search on the bottom. Now, it's true that autistic people are significantly better than non-autistic people on these tasks. They outperform non-autistic people. That is, they have superior visual search abilities when they're tested in these kinds of conditions. And this lab-based evidence has been used to support a major theoretical account of autism, Simon Baron-Cohen's systemizing account. Now, this theory says that autistic people have a strong preference to understand rule-based systems and will thus be better at the kinds of real-world tasks that rely on such systems. This is a big claim with many implications. Yet the research on which it is based has almost exclusively relied on paradigms designed for the computer or the tabletop, which are well controlled and presumed to represent the state of neurocognitive processes beyond the controlled test situation, but nevertheless fail to tap into or model abilities in the larger scale context that is, typical of everyday life. So a few years ago, some colleagues and I tested autistic children's ability to search in a physical, large-scale space. We called this a foraging task. We tried to make it as close to the computer-based visual search tasks as we could, while still being closer to more true-to-life settings. And this was our experimental setup. So we had 16 potential target locations, which were lit green. And the child, as you can see at the bottom, was told to begin by pressing an orange button nearby, and then to find the hidden red target as quickly as they could by pressing the switch at each green location. Now, critically, we probabilistically manipulated the block so that on 80% of trials, the target was presented on one side of space, which we called the rich side of space. Now, this experimental setup allowed us to test key claims of systemizing theory, but in a setting that was, closer to real life. Systemizing theory states that autistic people should be expert in recognizing the statistical regularities of stimuli within a system, to extract the if-then probability rules that govern the system, and to use those rules repeatedly to predict the system's future behaviour. Now, given these claims, we expected that autistic children should be superior at large-scale visual search. We tested explicitly whether autistic children were expert at inferring that probability rule, that is, whether they would search more often that rich side of space, whether they searched in an optimal or more efficient way, and whether individual children were more systematic in their search, just as the theory of systemizing would predict. Now, our results showed that such well-established reports of superior visual search in lab-based settings did not translate to autistic children's search in more true-to-life contexts. So the animation that you can see on your slide shows the search path by one neurotypical child on one particular trial of our foraging task. And as you can see, they carry out their search via, pretty much the shortest path, pressing all of the intervening buttons. The next animation I'll show you comes from one autistic child. Now, as you can see, his search is a little less systematic, possibly chaotic. Although he starts on the wrong side of space, he skips loads of intervening buttons, making his search much less efficient. These are obviously just two examples, but for the group as a whole, autistic children were on average less systematic in their search strategies, contrary to the prevailing theory of systemizing, and exactly the opposite of what the conventional lab-based work had shown. Now, although this shocked the scientific defenders of systemizing theory, none of it came as a surprise to people who actually lived with autistic people. In fact, these results had actually mapped on to what parents had told us about their children. So these parents, when they did our study, they also were asked to fill it in the questionnaire about everyday memory or memory within the context of everyday life. And specifically, parents of autistic children endorsed these two items significantly more than parents of non-autistic children. That is, they said that their autistic children were more likely to forget where things are normally kept or looking for them in the wrong place, and that they're more likely to get lost or turn in the wrong direction on a journey or on a walk or in a building where they've been once or twice before. Difficulties with search and navigation were therefore not unique to our foraging room. And the old lab-based work had misrepresented what was going on in life. Now, my second example comes from the field of executive function. So executive function is an umbrella term that includes those skills that largely mediated by the prefrontal cortex, which are necessary for goal-directed behaviours, particularly in new circumstances. Now, to give you an example, think back when you first learned to drive a car. You know, when you're first learning to do that, you need to hold a lot of information in your mind and you need to work with it. You need to remember, you know, that you have to put your foot on the clutch and then change the gear at the same time. You need to plan in your head all of those sequence of steps. And you also need to make sure that you're not distracted by other things going on, other, you know, cars and people outside, but also potentially, you know, your driving instructor talking in your ear. Now, these are the kinds of situations which require your executive function. Once you've learned to drive, however, these behaviours become automatic. So you're less likely to need to recruit your executive functions, unless you're doing something novel like driving in a new place. Now, anecdotal evidence has often suggested that autistic people have executive problems, and some have proposed that such problems might be linked in particular to the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviours in autism and problems managing everyday routines. Yet, despite decades of research on executive function in autism and hundreds of published papers, the existing scientific literature has almost nothing conclusive to say. Instead, it remains contradictory and confusing, with, according to a recent meta-analysis, group differences of only moderate effects. Now, such moderate effects are a far cry from the large effect sizes reported on questionnaire measures that are filled in by the autistic person themselves or someone's parent, of their real-world executive function, and the everyday planning and flexibility difficulties that are reported by autistic people and their parents in their own work. So why is there such a disparity between how autistic people and their families report their lives and the view of the established science? Once again, it's because experimental investigations of executive function in autism have heavily relied on structured behavioural paradigms designed for the computer or the tabletop to try and target, you know, specific components of executive function. Just like this one here on your slide, the so-called Tower of London task. So on this task, people are given, you know, sat down at a table on the tabletop. They're given a pegboard with red, white, and black beads, all set out in a particular configuration, the start state. And they're asked to move the beads from the start state to this new configuration, the end state, critically in the minimum number of moves. So when you're doing this task, you've got to think about, hold information in your mind and work with it. So it's working memory, but you've also got to plan ahead those sequence of steps in order to be able to plan efficiently. So better performance on this task reflects better planning ability. Such tasks, however, lack representativeness. That is, the correspondence between the task itself, that Tower of London task, and real life settings, what actually goes on in real life. They also lack generalizability. That is, the degree to which your performance on the Tower of London task actually predicts your performance in real life or problems in real life settings. Now, in my own work, you know, I have autistic children and young people who can pass these tasks, like the Tower of London, with ease. Yet they really struggle doing tasks that place demands on their executive function in everyday life, like shopping in the local grocery store or finding one's way around town. These tasks simply aren't measuring what we want them to measure in real life. Those kind of functional behaviours that are critical for achieving independence and autonomy in adulthood. We therefore need to develop a new approach that bridges the gap between lab and life, one that is less focused on abstracted laboratory-based experiments and more focused on the everyday experiences or challenges faced by autistic people. So what might that look like? I've given you one example already in the form of foraging. where we were able to keep that experimental control, but extend it to a context that is more true to life. The same that is true of executive function. So my PhD student, Lorcan Kenny, and I administered a more ecologically valid executive function task to autistic young people. And basically we wanted a task over which we had, again, some experimental control, but would approximate a more real life, everyday activity that might tax one's executive function. Simple though it sounds, the results were profound. And in fact, you can see the results of the task because it was filmed for a TV documentary in the UK, shown last year here on the ABC, called Are You Autistic? As you will see, we worked with a wonderful group of young autistic people, including the two presenters of the show, to examine how executive function works in a true life setting, in contrast to traditional lab-based experiments. So let's watch the clip. It's a bit of a long clip, but I think it's worth it. So this is now the essence of my work. I am aiming over the next few years to develop a host of new experiments which are just as rigorous and just as controlled as the traditional lab-based ones on which our knowledge of autism is based, but which have far greater representativeness and also generalizability, because that's how we're going to bridge this gap between lab and life. I'm sure you will have some reflections and suggestions on how we might do this. But before I close, there is one crucial component that I haven't yet talked about, but which I'm already certain we need. And that is autistic input in the design of these new approaches. So ever since the idea of autism was first developed in the 1940s, autism science has typically been designed and conducted without any significant input from autistic people and their families. And I think that has contributed towards research agendas and research methods that rarely relate to the experiences that autistic people have and some of the challenges they might face. And when I say input, I don't mean input as passive participants or subjects. They definitely have that, they're definitely participants in research. But what I mean is input in the decision-making processes around research. So having a say in the design and implementation of the research, in the analysis, in interpretation and dissemination of the findings. And as I know from my own work, this lack of involvement in the research process has resulted in real feelings of frustration. Indeed, in a focus group that I ran for one particular study, we were talking about these issues, and one autistic adult just looked at me rather skeptically and said, whatever I say, is it really going to influence anyone? Now, in responding to this problem, I've been drawing upon innovations in participatory, co-designed and co-produced research that I know already has a long history outside of autism. Many of you will have heard about studies co-designed with HIV and Aboriginal and First Nations communities. It is also an approach currently having sweeping effects on more basic science, including agriculture and environmental science, where it's widely reported that processes which draw on the practical wisdom of non-scientists can have a dramatic effect on both the research agenda, so what gets researched, and on the ability of research to discover otherwise hidden explanatory factors. As Jonathan Grant, the Vice Principal of King's College London, has put it, the best chances of future discovery lie increasingly in citizen science, a collaborative approach which engages people, asking them to participate in the actual research process itself. We have already begun to see the impact of science being conducted by or in partnership with autistic people themselves. The Canadian autism scientist Michelle Dawson, for example, has had an astonishing impact on the field in recent years by challenging some of the hidden and often prejudicial assumptions that have been rife in the academy for far too long. I'm going to give you one more example from my own work of how this kind of approach might help us to understand autism better, to know autism. And what I'm about to share comes from a study my colleagues and I are currently working on, very recent study. In it, we, and it's a wonderful team of autistic and non-autistic researchers, are exploring the everyday experiences of autistic people, parents of autistic children, and even young autistic people during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're comparing them with conventional views about autism generated from existing autism science. Now, conventional autism science has expected that autistic people, perhaps even more than anyone, have coped best with the lockdown, with that has been most governments' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. After all, the very word autism comes from the Greek autos, or isolated self. As one autistic adult described to me sarcastically, according to the theories, we self-isolate. We do that all our lives. So autistic people are ready for lockdown. Well, to discover whether that view and others like it were right or not, we spoke to 142 autistic people, parents of autistic children, and even young autistic people themselves about what their day-to-day lives had been like during the pandemic and the impact that they've felt the lockdown has had on their lives. Now, we have a wealth of data here with about 7,000 minutes of recordings of interviews with people over Zoom, over phone, email, and even live chat. Critically, our participatory approach, our co-production approach, that is the working in partnership together with autistic and non-autistic researchers, has had a huge influence on our work. Huge influence in terms of the size and depth of the sample, the community reach. I can tell you now that if I had done this study by myself without the connections of my autistic collaborators, it would have taken me months, if not a year or more, to recruit this number of people for this sort of interview-based study. Instead, we recruited this number of people in 48 hours, which is phenomenal. It's also had, this co-production approach has also had an influence in terms of the kinds of questions and the way in which they were asked, which ensured that the interviews that we did were respectful and supportive of our autistic participants. And having autistic people involved in the analysis draws attention to things that would otherwise be missed. So what did we find? We're obviously just in the preliminary stages of analysis, but so far the results are striking. Far from welcoming the isolation that came from lockdown, the majority of autistic people deeply missed social contact. One autistic adult describes, I don't need a lot of human contact, but I've been really needing more contact from my friends than I perhaps usually would. One young autistic 16-year-old said, I prefer, when she was talking about her best friend, I prefer hanging out with him in person as opposed to just over text, so I haven't been talking to him as much as I do, but still somewhat. I've really missed that. It's rare that I find somebody that I actually talk to, and in the first 5 minutes, I'm like, oh yes, I know everything about you because you're me with different interests. When I do, you got to treasure that. And parents also described how much their children crave their friends. They were mentioning their friends a lot more, or were asking, when they could go and play with their friends. Our participants' desire for social contact went further than their established social circles and quality friendships. Not having much, or in some cases any, social contact during the COVID-19 lockdown period made them long for it. One autistic adult said, I didn't realise how important that incidental human contact was to me. It was so incidental that it never really registered on my radar until it was gone. And then we have one 13-year-old who said, I think there are some students who are at school who are always just messing about and getting on my nerves. But now that I think about it, I'm almost longing to just see them running down with a load of lolly packets wanting to sell them to each other. I've realised how much I would actually miss them. Mind you, it isn't a lot, but I wasn't expecting to miss them at all. Now, these have real and important implications for all aspects of life. When it came to school or therapy, for example, our participants also noted that the online connections simply weren't enough. One young person summed it up: just the idea of talking over Zoom and stuff is not the same as a real person. The apparent unease in these online interactions had dire consequences with regard to their access to services during the pandemic. So autistic adults, parents of autistic children, and especially young people themselves simply decided either not to access telehealth services or to access them and then stop them altogether, because they felt that the therapeutic sessions have to be face-to-face. I need that personal interaction. Ultimately, this meant, rather worryingly, that many of our participants stopped receiving therapeutic services during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this final quote is from a 17-year-old who said, "I stopped all of my psychologist appointments, which was a bad call, because if it's an online version of a medical appointment of any sort, I just dread it. And the dread is often worse than not doing the appointment." And through this example, we can see what a terrible effect getting the science wrong can have on the realities of autistic people's lives. Just contrast our findings with conventional science and conventional practice, with the assumption that autistic people don't want friends or they don't want social contact, that they prefer social isolation. Conventional science still cleaves to a view of autistic asociality derived from age-old experiments and theories. And that means conventional practice has followed that science to the detriment of actually autistic experience, presuming that this is what autistic people want or will be willing to put up with, when in fact exactly the opposite is the case. Thankfully, it doesn't have to carry on like this. We can do autism science in a different kind of way, attentive to real life and open to the perspectives of autistic people themselves. And if we do that, we will have a far better chance of avoiding these problems. All of the investment will be worth it after all, and we will have a new way of knowing autism. Thank you very much.
Liz, thank you very much. It was really very, very interesting indeed. I have to say, as I said to you, I think before we started, I knew very little about autism. Feel a little bit wiser now, not much. But I will say, as someone who maybe I could ask the first question, who is often involved in trying to take evidence-based approaches to complex decision making. We have lots of these issues in government. This new approach that you're proposing, which I completely agree with, how do you really get data that's reproducible and generalizable in the sense of guiding people in the future about intervention? Do you know what I mean? So what you're proposing are experiments that are, very much hands-on, very much in the real world, and video clips and conversations. But how do you get that to an evidence base that really genuinely allows you to make that repeatable and generalizable to all the things that you need to do? Quite a hard problem, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. The things that I've shown you are obviously, particularly on the documentary, it was obviously an extreme example of how we might go about doing that. But I think there are ways, and in the foraging example that I gave you, where we do have that greater experimental control. It is reproducible, yeah, so I think it is coming. It's been clever, trying to be innovative and coming up with ways in which we can retain that experimental control, but actually try to make it, more real life. I think there are also, technologies that we can also harness So virtual reality and augmented reality are ways in which we can again retain experimental control, manipulate various variables, and to see how people perform in various tasks. So I think that there are ways we can do it. I don't think it's as easy as doing lab-based research. It does come with challenges, but I think we need to begin to think of other ways, because otherwise we're just getting it wrong.
Good. Well, we might have a further conversation offline, actually. Let me pick up some questions from the audience. And I might start with one that actually I'm quite interested in too, because I've often led large organizations where we talk about the fact that certainly in the computer science area, we actually hire people who are so-called on the spectrum. And the question here is, we're often told that some high-functioning individuals are on the autism spectrum. Is this true, or is this a myth?
There are, so autism, so what I didn't give you is a kind of description of autism. So autism is it was once considered quite a rare condition, only kind of occurring in 5 and 10,000 children. Now the prevalence estimates are up to maybe 1 in, depending on what they are, between 1 in 50 and 100 people. So you should be coming across autistic people in your lives. And yes, they can be so-called high functioning, not a term necessarily I like to use, because even people who might come across as high functioning don't necessarily, people also might need supports in order to be able to do that. But most certainly there are lots of people around that you might not think are autistic, but actually are. And one thing in particular that we've seen in the last 5 years, really, maybe a bit longer, is a focus on girls and women who are autistic. So, the diagnosis itself, the description of autism, and all our diagnostic tools are really focused on boys and men, because that's what we've traditionally, that's what people have traditionally focused on. And now the focus is more on, well, hang on a second, we might actually be missing, there might be girls and women out there who are missing out on diagnoses, or who are being misdiagnosed with other things, who actually, are autistic and may well need support. And lots of people, not just girls and women, but also boys and men, report what's kind of called in the community as masking. It's almost kind of like pretending to be normal. So even though people, again, come across as like high functioning, it is this kind of sense of the, it's potentially taking a lot of effort to actually look like that and function in their everyday lives.
I mean, I might have a small follow-up there, in the sense that, again, as I mentioned, I've often led organizations that almost, not require, but facilitate engagements with people who are very focused, who are, again, one wrongly or rightly, and I think this is the challenge that we have, we think of as slightly on the spectrum, but they're positive in the way that, that a scientific or an engineering organization might work, if you see what I mean. I mean, how do we generalize that? How do we genuinely make roles more accessible to people like that? And I often find in these roles that other engineers and scientists are actually quite accepting, but often people who are more in the non-scientific roles in these organizations are perhaps less accepting, because it's not more normal for them, if you see what I mean. How as a person who leads an organization, how does you genuinely embrace this?
I think it comes from I think it's a kind of a leadership, a senior leadership, and kind of the ethos of an organization about promoting kind of inclusive attitudes to work. So I ran in London. We are currently running actually a program with Deutsche Bank UK, where it's an internship program for autistic graduates. So these are obviously people who are graduated from university and come in and want to work in Deutsche Bank in various departments. And they've put in an internship scheme in order to support specifically autistic graduates. And it's interesting what you say about kind of different departments not necessarily maybe being as receptive to autistic people. We noted that sometimes training about autism and about how, being inclusive in the workplace was also necessary for people in human resources, just as it was for people in the risks department or on the trading floor or whatever. So I think there are definitely ways in which, you can promote an inclusive environment in the workplace, but also promote I think really open communication, because people need to be able to say, look, I need these kind of adjustments in order to be able to work most productively. And that might just be, being able to work with headphones so that they can kind of exclude extraneous noise or things like that. And so it's about, people being open about those kind of things. But that's that's an attitude shift that is sometimes quite, that's hard to do.
So I'll just pick up on a question here from Penny Robinson in the audience here. I mean, you can almost sense my awkwardness as well. Should we stop people using these sort of functional labels, or should we embrace it? What's the right thing?
So this idea of high functioning and low functioning, I definitely do not like.
Well, even the autism label itself, should we be genuinely be open about it?
I mean, that's a really good question. For some people, for lots of people, having an autism the actual diagnosis, the label, brings with it services and supports. So people, kids get support in schools. People get support through the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It brings with it a whole host of other supports and services. Which could be hugely beneficial to people, and it also brings a sense of identity as well for people. So I think the label itself can have utility, but then there are other people that might think that we need to embrace human diversity, neurodiversity, in all of its forms. And I think that's a really, I think we should be doing that. But it is difficult to it's a difficult issue to address, I think, because there are, benefits to both of those approaches.
So here's a very different question, and it's one, again, I sometimes struggle with, from Alexandra Meldrum. It seems to me amazing how much time, effort, and money is spent in areas like medical research sometimes, with relatively little impact. What should we do with research funding to increase that relevancy and impact? I mean, given your experiences here, is there, should we encourage a different approach altogether?
Sorry, what was that last bit?
Should we encourage a completely different approach?
So, I mean, what I'm not saying is that we should stop funding autism research or any other kind of medical conditions. I don't want to say that at all, because there have been, incremental discoveries, but I think as the person said, there is this kind of huge gap between what the kind of things that get researched and what and the impact that it has on people's lives. I mean, I think I'm trying to suggest a new approach that we need to really. It's not just about. So, one issue is about the translation of research, so there's all this research that gets done, it's just not being translated. And that's definitely a problem, that translational pathway. But what I'm suggesting is that it might be, for at least not all of the science, but, some of the science, there might be a problem with, the science itself. And so, I'm obviously just starting on this particular work. So I'm very open to suggestions about how, we might go about actually shifting at least a little bit that science.
Yeah. That's interesting. I got one last question here from Sandra Jones, who's PVC for engagement at the Australian Catholic University. And she asks, how do we get ethics committees to recognise autistic people have capacity to consent? And she signs herself, interestingly, Autistic Professor. and mother.
Thanks so much, Sandra. I actually haven't had that experience of autistic people not, ethics committees not seeing, autistic people for who they are, and that they and to give consent. And in fact, yeah, all of the university ethics committees that I've been involved with have been very receptive, both to our participants, but also our collaborators, about being, having them on board, and their input into our research as partners in the research process. So I think maybe I've just been very lucky at UCL and Macquarie about having fantastic ethics committees. But I think there is some work to do about to ensure that we're not patronising to our autistic participants, and that they have autonomy, they have decision making powers, and they should be allowed to exercise them. So I think we do need to do some work there, but I've been very lucky in my experiences so far.
So thank you very much, Liz. Very fascinating talk, and work doing it in this environment, which is never as easy as doing it in front of an audience. So thank you so much. I think we've sent you a hardback of the history of the New South Wales coast and a nice bottle of Semillon, appropriately called Elizabeth. So please enjoy it on our behalf.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone in the audience, and I invite you to join us at the next seminar on Wednesday, the 19th of August, when the talk will be from the University of Wollongong's Senior Professor Ross Bradstock, and he will talk about the science of bushfire risk. Very, very topical in this year of calamities. My office will be in touch both via our email database and through Twitter to confirm whether this seminar will be held at Parliament House as well as by live stream. So thank you again, Liz. Thank you, audience. And we'll talk to you next time. Cheers.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.